In this video, we're looking at a simple approach that can help you generate ideas and write better papers faster. The approach I want to talk about is called the EPA method. But before we get to that, I want to run through a hypothetical situation here. Let's say you were just assigned a paper. This is usually how it goes. First off, sit at a computer. Second, come up with a thesis. Outline how you're going to support that thesis. Look for a bunch of quotes that support that outline that supports that thesis. Maybe proofread it or edit it a few times and call it good. Now, I say most people approach paper writing this way because that's what I've seen in a lot of my students, and it's how I used to approach writing papers myself. But the EPA method kind of flips that on its head. And before we get into what this method actually is, I want to tell you why that typical approach is not the best way to write a paper. So first off, sitting down in front of a computer, let's call it what it is. You are sitting down in front of the world's greatest distraction machine, something that is literally engineered to take your mind elsewhere. Next up, coming up with your thesis. Well, obviously you want to have a good thesis, but the problem is, if you haven't done all the thinking and brainstorming that goes into writing a paper, how are you supposed to have your final central argument already? And finally, finding quotes to support your thesis is great, but if you already have a set thesis when you start doing your research, then you're only finding quotes that support that thesis, and you're really undermining the whole writing process. What I mean by that is you're not looking at the research to guide your argument, you're looking at your argument to guide your research. In their famous Demystifying Guide to Academic Writing, Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein warn about this approach. It can be somewhat misleading to speak of finding your thesis and finding relevant quotes as two separate steps, one coming after the other. When you're deeply engaged in the writing and revising process, there is usually a great deal of back and forth between your argument and any quotations you select. Okay, so I've told you what you probably shouldn't do when it comes to writing a paper. Let's talk about what this method is and how it helps you actually write a better paper faster. First off, the EPA method has nothing to do with protecting the environment, although we should protect the environment, really. It actually stands for evidence, patterns, argument. And perhaps the most important thing when it comes to using this method is following it in that order. Evidence, patterns, arguments. Most instructors ask students to start with a thesis, but as we said earlier, this fails to acknowledge an important truth about writing. The act of writing is less about the display of knowledge than it is the acquisition of it. In other words, we learn as we write. Writing a paper forces us to look at topics and arguments carefully. As I said, we don't want to theorize a thesis and only research in an effort to prove what we already suspected. So if you have an idea of your thesis already going into writing a paper, that's great, but I want to pitch to you the freedom of a working thesis. A statement or maybe even just a question that you're not entirely sure of, but that you go back and adjust after you're done writing your paper. Okay, so maybe the easiest way to illustrate this method in practice is to talk about a hypothetical paper. So let's talk about a work that a lot of people read when studying English in high school, William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Usually, I would be gathering all my evidence for the paper on pencil and paper itself, because as I said, world's greatest distraction machine. But I feel like if I were to just show you how I actually handwrite this stuff, you wouldn't be able to see what I'm actually talking about. So for the sake of clarity, I'm going to be doing it on a computer screen here. So let's say this paper is asking you to make an argument about Romeo and Juliet. That's a terrible prompt. It's not specific at all. But let's pretend we have a terrible prompt. One of the great ways to brainstorm is to make comparisons. So let's pick two characters that we wouldn't think have a lot in common and see if we can come up with some comparisons about them. So I've selected for this hypothetical paper, Romeo and Tybalt. Also, if you haven't read Romeo and Juliet yet, there's some spoilers in here, just be aware of that. Okay, so here's the evidence I have just brainstorming about Romeo and Tybalt. They're both young, they both live in Verona, they come from well-off families, they are both passionate, Juliet cares for both of them, and they are both violent. Okay, so I really streamlined the evidence portion of the EPA method, but that's because I don't want to make a 30-minute video about it. And I don't think you want to watch a 30-minute video about it. But don't rush the evidence. You might have to do some research if you're writing a research paper. You might have to just think about it while you're going on a walk. You might have to dive back into the text and start gathering quotes, or look at the notes you have, or talk to your professor or teacher or classmates for ideas. Whatever it is that helps you generate ideas, this is the evidence portion of it, and it's incredibly important. And when you put this on paper, you start to create a roadmap, so when you sit down in front of the world's greatest distraction machine, you know where you're going. So now that we've gotten our evidence though, we move into the P portion of the EPA method, which is look for patterns. Now what I mean by patterns is different sections of evidence that you can group together to eventually lead you to an argument. And the sections I want to look at, just looking at this evidence here, is come from well-off families, passionate, Juliet cares for both of them, and they're violent. The reason why I say these are patterns is because well-off families and Juliet caring for both of them work really well together, right? Because Juliet has a family connection to each of them, Tybalt being her cousin, Romeo being her husband. You also have passion connecting to Juliet caring for both of them, because passion and caring, and then obviously passion and violence go together. So we're starting to see some patterns form here. And if we were doing this as a research paper and not just working with the text itself, we could bring in some research about the original plot of Romeo and Juliet that William Shakespeare borrowed from. Borrowed is a very loose word here, by the way, but he made some important changes, one of which is he did not make it a morality play about why children should listen to their parents. Instead, it's about how parents can destroy their children by trying to protect them from things that are inevitable, or that they don't understand, or that they don't really need protected from, such as, falling in love with someone who's part of another family that you've had a feud with for so long that you can't remember how it even started. And we see this really take place with the ending scene with the Capulets and Montagues as they make peace, unfortunately, too late after Romeo and Juliet have already had their infamous last scene together. So we're starting to draw some argument here, which is that the family's attempt to extinguish Romeo and Juliet's love is not only futile, but fatal. And now I'm starting to get closer to my central argument here, because we're starting to see that Romeo and Tybalt, while they seem like opposites, actually have a lot in common, because in many ways they are both destroyed by this feud, and the passion they have for their family and loved ones ends up being corrupted in a way and destroying them. So I think we've kind of settled on a thesis here, and again, this is a really sped up process, but what do you think about this? Romeo and Juliet dramatizes a conflict between romantic and familial love. By closely examining Romeo and Tybalt's characters, one can clearly see that Shakespeare sides with the former. And looking that back over, I might actually change the former to romantic love. Since it's your thesis, you want to be really clear. And the former, we have a couple pairings in there. You could think that Shakespeare sides with Tybalt's character over Romeo. And again, this is the sort of stuff that happens in the EPA method. I haven't typed anything out really. Remember, I'd be doing all this on pencil and paper. But if you're disciplined enough to just focus on your Word document and your research, then you can do this on the computer. And if you look at everything we've put together, we really have a paper in place already. We have a thesis, and those patterns simply become topic sentences. And all the evidence under those patterns or grouped into those patterns becomes our support for those topic sentences. And when we kind of step back from this, most of the paper is already written before I've even sat down in front of the world's greatest distraction machine. All that's left to do now is put it together, make it flow really well, edit a little bit, sit on it for a day, read it one more time, have someone else read it, whatever it might be, and it is good to go. And I promise you, even though you're not typing right away, this method will help you write papers faster because you have a plan when you do sit down to type. One final bonus tip here, I might actually make a full video on this in the future, but I want to encourage you to avoid three-part thesis statements. The reason for that is you see a lot of these thesis statements, especially in 5-paragraph essays, and the problem is those 3 parts are actually your 3 topic sentences. And you haven't actually provided a central argument if you're using a 3-part or 3-point thesis statement. A 3-point thesis statement might work if you're talking about 20 plus pages, but anything under that, you really should have your argument boiled down to close to a single point. So if we have our 5-paragraph essay here on Romeo and Juliet, and the thesis statement is something like, Romeo and Tybalt are both loved by Juliet, passionate, and violent individuals. That's not a thesis statement. Those are topic sentences. But if you can synthesize them into something like we did earlier in the paper, bring them together and have them work for a single aim, then you have a thesis statement. So if you write a 3-part thesis, then you are kind of already doing the EPA method, maybe not on paper, but in your head. And that's an okay working thesis. But remember, when you're done typing your paper and you read it again, go back and adjust your thesis. You'll almost always need to shift it or tweak it a little bit. You might even find that you don't agree with your original thesis. Again, I want to leave you with a quote from They Say, I Say about the beauty of that seemingly discouraging and unfortunate situation. Although finding out late in the game that you aren't fully convinced by your own argument can be painful, it can actually make your final text more intellectually honest, challenging, and serious. After all, the goal of writing is not to keep proving that whatever you initially said is right, but to stretch the limits of your thinking.